The glass tower stood high above the city, its polished windows reflecting the morning sun. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with energy. It was one of those days when the company's future was hanging by a thread, and everyone knew it. At the center of it all was a billionaire, a man who had built his empire with sharp deals, endless ambition, and a reputation for being ruthless. People admired him, feared him, and some even envied him. But behind closed doors he carried himself with arrogance so heavy that it crushed anyone who stood in his way. The boardroom had been prepared for this important meeting for days. The long wooden table gleamed, water bottles stood neatly beside each chair, and documents were stacked in tidy piles. Executives shuffled nervously in their seats, waiting for the arrival of the one person who could determine whether this company's big deal would move forward. A woman known for her quiet strength and sharp mind. She walked in with grace, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Her presence was commanding without being loud. She wore a white dress that gave her an air of confidence and simplicity, and in her hand she carried a sleek black bag that seemed almost too ordinary to hold the power it carried. She was not there for show. She was there for business. When she entered, heads turned. Some nodded respectfully. Others looked at her with curiosity. But the billionaire leaned back in his chair, a mocking smile tugging at his lips. To him, she was just another staff member, someone who had to work to prove herself in his world. She walked straight toward him and extended her hand politely. It was a gesture of professionalism, a sign of respect. The room went quiet for a second, waiting to see how he would respond. The billionaire glanced at her hand, then chuckled. His laughter grew louder, filling the room like thunder. "I don't shake hands with staff," he said with a smirk, his voice dripping with disdain. The words hung heavy in the air. The executives around the table shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes, others sneaking nervous glances at one another. The insult was sharp, cutting, and deliberate. It wasn't just a refusal to shake her hand. It was a dismissal of her entire presence. But she didn't flinch. She didn't let her face betray even a flicker of hurt or anger. Instead, she calmly lowered her hand and stood tall, her gaze steady on his. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet strength that unsettled those who noticed it. The billionaire leaned back even further in his chair, clearly pleased with himself. He thought he had put her in her place. To him, this was just another reminder of his power. But what he didn't realize was that this woman was no ordinary staff member. She was the key to something much bigger than his ego could comprehend. The room remained tense, the silence broken only by the sound of the billionaire's laughter. He thought it was all a joke. To him, this was just another day of showing off. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. The woman's calm demeanor was not weakness. It was the calm before the storm. She moved to her seat at the table and placed her bag gently on the chair beside her. She did not raise her voice, nor did she retaliate with harsh words. Instead, she opened her folder and began reviewing the documents in front of her, as though his insult had never happened. But her silence spoke louder than anything else in that room. The executives could feel it too. The air seemed thicker now, as if something unseen was pressing down on them. A few of them glanced nervously at the billionaire, who was still chuckling, completely unaware of the shift in power that was about to take place. Minutes passed, but the weight of that moment remained. To the billionaire, it was business as usual, another day, another deal. To her, it was an opportunity. She knew exactly who she was, what she represented, and what she carried in her bag. He saw only a staff member. She knew she was the gatekeeper to billions. And while he laughed, thinking he had humiliated her, the truth was simple. He had only humiliated himself. The story of respect and arrogance had just begun. The billionaire's laughter faded into small chuckles as he turned his attention to the stack of papers in front of him. For him, the meeting was routine. He was used to people bending, nodding, and agreeing with whatever he said. He believed this meeting would be no different. After all, in his eyes, he held all the power. But across the table, the woman sat quietly, her posture perfect, her expression calm. She did not fidget or shuffle her papers nervously like some of the executives. Instead, she took her time, flipping through the documents with deliberate care, her pen gliding softly across the page as she marked certain lines. To an outsider, it might have looked like nothing unusual, but the executives in the room sensed something different. Her silence was not weakness. It was authority disguised in composure. Every movement she made carried weight, and even the smallest action seemed intentional. The billionaire, however, was blind to it all. He leaned back in his chair with his usual arrogance, tapping his pen on the table. "Let's get this over with," he said, his voice loud and dismissive. "Time is money, and I don't have time to waste on formalities." His words drew awkward glances from the others in the room. They had heard stories about this woman, how she was not just a representative but the lead negotiator for one of the most powerful investment funds in the world. Some knew that her signature alone could release billions of dollars into a project, or take them away, yet the billionaire treated her like an assistant who had stumbled into the wrong meeting. The woman didn't respond to his arrogance. She simply adjusted the watch on her wrist and placed a neatly folded document on the table. With quiet confidence, she looked around the room and made eye contact with each executive. Her calm gaze unsettled them more than the billionaire's laughter ever could. The tension grew thicker. The executives began shifting in their seats, sensing that something was coming. One of them cleared his throat nervously, trying to move the meeting forward. But before anyone could speak, she leaned forward and closed her folder with a soft click. The sound was so small, yet it echoed like thunder in the silent room. She looked directly at the billionaire, her voice calm but firm. "Respect is a two-way street," she said softly, her words cutting through the air. "When it's missing, no amount of money can fix what's broken." Her tone was not angry, not emotional, just steady, the kind of voice that carried truth. The executives froze, waiting for the billionaire's reaction. He laughed again, though this time it sounded a little forced. "Respect?" he said mockingly. "Respect doesn't build companies. Money does, deals do, and I have more of both than anyone else at this table." She didn't blink. Her calmness was almost unsettling. Slowly, she reached into her black bag and pulled out a single folder, slimmer than the one before. She placed it gently in front of her and tapped it once with her finger. "This," she said, "was supposed to be the final approval. $4 billion of investment backing. Enough to expand your empire into markets you've only dreamed about." The executives gasped quietly, their eyes widening as they realized what she was holding. It wasn't just paperwork. It was the future of the company. Every man and woman at that table knew how much depended on her decision. The billionaire's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. He leaned forward, trying to regain his bravado. "Good," he said with a sharp smile. "Then let's sign it and move on." But she didn't move. Instead, she slid the folder back into her bag and closed it. The soft sound of the zipper seemed louder than anything else in the room. "Respect," she repeated, her voice still calm, "comes before signatures, before deals, before billions." The room fell completely silent. The executives sat frozen, their eyes darting between the billionaire and the woman. The balance of power had shifted in an instant, and everyone felt it. The billionaire tried to laugh again, but this time no one joined him. His arrogance was starting to crack. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't the one controlling the room anymore. She adjusted her chair and folded her hands neatly on the table. "5 minutes ago," she continued, her voice never rising, "you decided I was staff, that my hand was not worth shaking, that my presence was not worth respect. But what you failed to see is that I am not here to serve you. I am here to decide whether you deserve the $4 billion behind me." Gasps rippled through the room. Some executives lowered their heads, embarrassed by the billionaire's earlier insult. Others stared at him with quiet judgment. The truth was out, and it could no longer be ignored. The billionaire's face reddened. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was a man who always had a quick answer, a sharp comeback, or a dismissive remark. But now, faced with the calm strength of the woman across from him, he found himself speechless. The silence dragged on. The woman didn't rush to fill it. She sat there patiently, as though time itself was on her side. And in a way, it was. Finally, she stood up, her movements graceful but firm. She picked up her bag, adjusted the strap over her shoulder, and looked around the room one last time. Her eyes met those of every executive, lingering just long enough to leave a mark. To the billionaire, she said only this: "I don't shake hands with arrogance." And with that, she walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind a stunned silence that no one dared to break. The heavy boardroom doors closed behind her with a soft thud, but the echo remained long after she left. The executives sat frozen, their eyes darting around nervously. No one knew what to say. The billionaire shifted uncomfortably in his chair, trying to hide his unease. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel in control. He forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "She'll be back," he muttered, waving his hand dismissively. "They always come back. Money talks." But deep inside, he wasn't as confident as his voice tried to suggest. The words she had spoken replayed in his mind. "I don't shake hands with arrogance." They cut deeper than he cared to admit. Meanwhile, the woman walked calmly down the marble hallway outside the boardroom. Each step echoed with quiet power. She was not rushing. She was not flustered. She carried herself like someone who knew the weight of the decision she had just made. The black bag at her side was more than just leather and metal. It was the future of billions of dollars, jobs, and dreams, and she carried it with the same calmness she carried herself. A junior executive hurried after her, calling out, "Ma'am, please wait. He didn't mean." She turned, her gaze steady but not unkind. "I know exactly what he meant," she said softly, "and that is why this meeting is over." The young man lowered his eyes, embarrassed. He knew she was right. Respect couldn't be demanded after it was denied. It had to be given freely from the very beginning. Back in the boardroom, the executives finally found their voices. "Do you realize what you've done?" one whispered to the billionaire, his face pale. "What?" The billionaire shot back, irritation creeping into his voice. "She's just one person." "She's not just one person," another executive said firmly. "She is the lead negotiator for Horizon Global Investments. Do you have any idea what that means?" The billionaire frowned. He had heard the name before, but in his arrogance, he hadn't connected it to the woman who had just walked out. Horizon Global was one of the largest private investment funds in the world. Their influence stretched across continents, touching everything from technology and infrastructure to healthcare and renewable energy. They weren't just investors. They were kingmakers, and the woman he had just mocked was their representative. The realization hit him like ice water. His smirk vanished, and for the first time his hands trembled slightly. "How much backing was she carrying?" he asked, though his voice betrayed the fear creeping in. One of the executives swallowed hard. $4 billion. The billionaire's face turned red, then pale. He slammed his fist on the table, trying to regain some sense of power. "No, she wouldn't walk away from a deal this big. She can't. She needs us." But the truth was clear to everyone else in the room. She didn't need him. He needed her. While he sat there, trying to deny reality, she was already in the lobby, greeted respectfully by her driver. People passing by turned their heads, sensing her presence, though they didn't know her name. Power, when carried with dignity, doesn't need to be announced. It simply speaks for itself. She stepped into the car, closed the door, and exhaled quietly. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even surprised. She had seen arrogance like his before. But what he failed to understand was that the world was changing. Power was no longer in the hands of those who shouted the loudest. It belonged to those who commanded respect without asking for it. As the car pulled away, she took out her phone and sent a simple message: "Deal withdrawn, respect absent." Within minutes, the ripple began. Calls were made, emails were sent. Across the city, and soon across the globe, people began to hear whispers that the billionaire's deal had collapsed. Investors grew nervous. Partners began to doubt. Competitors started to circle, sensing blood in the water. Back in the boardroom, the executives' phones buzzed one by one. Their faces grew grim as they read the messages. Some looked at the billionaire with open disappointment, others with thinly veiled anger. He had not only embarrassed himself, he had jeopardized all of them. One brave executive finally spoke. "You've destroyed this company's biggest opportunity with your arrogance." The billionaire glared at him, his pride still refusing to bend. "No, I'll fix it. I'll call her back." But even as he said the words, deep down he knew. Some things couldn't be fixed. Not with money, not with charm, and certainly not with arrogance. At that same moment, the woman sat in her car, watching the skyline fade as they drove away. She thought about the meeting, about the billionaire's laughter, about the look on his face when he realized who she truly was. But most of all, she thought about the lesson. Too often, people in power forgot that respect was the foundation of every deal, every partnership, every relationship. Without it, money meant nothing. She had built her career on that belief, and today had only proven it once again. She closed her eyes for a moment, not with exhaustion, but with clarity. The world would soon learn what had happened in that boardroom, and when it did, it wouldn't be her reputation on the line, it would be his. And so, the calm before the storm had passed. The storm itself was about to begin. The news spread faster than the billionaire could react. By the time he stormed out of the boardroom and into his private office, phones were already ringing off the hook. His secretary tried to keep up with the calls, her hands shaking as she transferred them, but it was impossible. Partners, investors, and journalists all wanted the same thing: answers. The billionaire slammed the door behind him, his face red with frustration. He paced the room, muttering to himself. $4 billion. She wouldn't walk away. She can't just walk away. But she had. He picked up his phone and dialed her number, the one card he had been handed weeks earlier. His finger tapped the desk impatiently as it rang. But the call didn't go through. It wasn't rejected, it was simply blocked. His power, once so absolute, had hit a wall. Meanwhile, across town, the woman sat in a quiet office overlooking the river. Unlike the billionaire's space, which screamed wealth and power with its gold accents and oversized furniture, her office was calm, simple, and filled with warmth. A framed photograph of her parents rested on the desk beside her laptop. A plant by the window leaned toward the sun. It was a place not of intimidation, but of purpose. Her team gathered around her, waiting for her decision. They had worked hard on the deal, prepared every detail, and now they watched her with quiet respect. She didn't rush. She never did. Instead, she looked at each one of them and said, "We will find someone who values respect." This deal was never about him. It was about the future. And the future does not belong to arrogance. The words filled the room with renewed energy. They knew she wasn't walking away from opportunity. She was walking toward something greater. Back at the billionaire's company, chaos was brewing. Word had leaked that Horizon Global Investments had withdrawn their support. Stock prices began to dip. Analysts speculated about the collapse. Competitors, always waiting for weakness, circled like sharks in the water. In the boardroom, the executives sat in silence, each processing the weight of what had happened. For years, they had endured the billionaire's arrogance because his deals always delivered. But now, for the first time, his arrogance had cost them dearly. Billions, in fact. One of the senior executives finally broke the silence. "We need to face the truth. He isn't invincible, and if we keep following him blindly, we'll sink with him." The words hung heavy in the room. Heads nodded slowly. Respect, once demanded by the billionaire, was now shifting away from him and toward the woman who had walked out with her head held high. As the hours passed, the billionaire's desperation grew. He called partners only to find that they too had heard the story. Some were polite, others blunt, but the message was the same. If Horizon won't work with you, neither will we. He clenched his fists, his pride screaming at him to fight back. But even he knew. It wasn't a matter of money anymore. It was a matter of respect. That evening, as the city lights flickered on, the woman attended a dinner hosted by other industry leaders. She didn't boast about what had happened. She didn't need to. The story had already traveled, whispered from one table to another. How she had stood her ground, how she had walked away with dignity, and how a billionaire had been humbled in front of his own board. When she entered the room, people stood to greet her, hands extended toward her, not out of obligation but out of genuine respect. She shook each one, her smile warm but steady. She didn't need to demand acknowledgement. It came to her naturally. At one point during the evening, an older gentleman, a respected figure in the business world, leaned across the table and said, "You've done more today than secure or deny money. You've reminded everyone what leadership really means." Her response was simple. Leadership begins with respect. Without it, everything else falls apart. The words struck a chord, and those around her nodded. They knew she was right. Back at the billionaire's office, the atmosphere had turned grim. His once loyal team was beginning to drift away. Some made quiet calls to competitors. Others updated their resumes. They had seen the writing on the wall. His empire was crumbling, not because of market forces or poor strategy, but because of a single moment of arrogance that revealed the weakness beneath his wealth. Alone in his office, he stared at the city skyline, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. For the first time in years, he felt small. The laughter that had once been his weapon now echoed back at him like a cruel reminder. Meanwhile, the woman returned home late that night, tired, but at peace. She set her bag down by the darter and sat quietly on the couch, reflecting on the day. She thought about the look on the billionaire's face when he realized who she was. She thought about the silence in the boardroom, the shifting eyes, the weight of her decision. But most of all, she thought about the lesson that needed to be shared. Not for her own pride, but for the countless people who had been dismissed, underestimated or disrespected simply because someone else thought they held all the power. The storm had arrived. But she stood at its center, calm and unshaken. And as the world watched, the balance of power had shifted forever. The morning after the storm felt different. For the billionaire, the world no longer looked the same. His office, once filled with buzzing energy and eager assistance, was strangely quiet. The phone still rang, but fewer people answered. The air felt heavy, as if even the walls had grown tired of his arrogance. He sat behind his desk, staring at the pile of newspapers spread out in front of him. Every headline carried his name. Billionaire's deal collapses after disrespect scandal. 4 billion pulled in dramatic withdrawal. Industry leader exposed for arrogance. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. Each article painted the same picture. A man who had believed himself untouchable, undone not by market crashes or fierce competition, but by his own pride. The empire he had built for decades was now shaking, and he knew it. For the first time, in years, silence scared him. Across the city, the woman began her day differently. She poured herself a cup of tea, opened her window to let in the fresh morning air, and smiled at the warmth of the sun. Her phone buzzed with messages, congratulations, invitations, and proposals. Companies wanted to work with her. Leaders wanted to meet her, and young professionals wanted to learn from her. But she wasn't focused on fame. She wasn't interested in the attention or the sudden praise. Her focus remained steady as it always had, creating opportunities where respect was valued as highly as profit. At Horizon Global's headquarters, she stood before her team and said, "What happened yesterday wasn't about a man or a deal. It was about something bigger. It was about dignity. We don't just invest money, we invest trust. And where trust and respect are missing, there is no foundation strong enough to build upon." Her words ignited her team. They knew they weren't just moving numbers around on a spreadsheet. They were shaping the future with principles that mattered. Back at the billionaire's company, the executives gathered in the boardroom again, but this time their energy was different. The loyalty they once showed to him had vanished. One by one, they voiced their concerns. Some spoke of lost investors, Others mentioned their personal reputations being tied to his mistakes. Finally, one senior member stood up and said what everyone else had been thinking. Respect is the currency you ran out of. And now, without it, money means nothing. The billionaire felt his chest tighten. He wanted to shout, to remind them of the wealth he had created, the risks he had taken, the victories he had won. But deep down he knew they were right. His empire was not crumbling because of outside forces. It was crumbling because of him. He thought back to that moment, the outstretched hand, the smirk on his face, the words he had spoken without thought. I don't shake hands with staff. He had believed he was making a point. Instead, he had destroyed everything. The irony was cruel. The very hand he refused to shake had carried $4 billion in backing. A single handshake, a gesture of respect, could have changed everything. Instead, his arrogance had turned it all to dust. Meanwhile, the woman attended a leadership conference a week later. She didn't tell the story to boast, but to teach. Standing before a crowd of young entrepreneurs, she spoke from the heart. Power is not in wealth, she said. Power is not in how many people you command. True power is in how you treat those around you. A handshake, a word of kindness, a moment of respect, these are the foundations that build legacies. Without them, even the richest man can fall. The audience sat in silence, hanging on every word. Some nodded, others scribbled notes, but all of them felt the weight of her truth. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize her story. She simply told it with honesty. And that honesty resonated more than any numbers or figures ever could. Her words traveled far beyond the conference hall. They were quoted in articles, shared on social media, and discussed in boardrooms around the world. She became a symbol not just of success, but of dignity, reminding people everywhere that respect is the greatest investment anyone can make. The billionaire, meanwhile, watched from the shadows of his crumbling empire. Deals slipped through his fingers. Investors vanished. Even his once loyal allies began to distance themselves. In quiet moments, he thought about the woman. He thought about the calmness in her eyes, the firmness in her voice, the way she had walked away without anger but with absolute certainty. For the rest of his life, he would never forget her words. I don't shake hands with arrogance. It became the lesson that haunted him. For her, however, it became the lesson that inspired others. She had proven that one act of disrespect could bring down empires, but one act of dignity could build new ones. And so, the story lived on, not as a tale of a billionaire's fall, but as a reminder to the world that no matter how much money you have, how much power you hold, or how high you climb, respect remains the strongest foundation of all. The billionaire had lost billions. The woman had gained something far greater, the trust and admiration of an entire generation. And in the end, the world didn't remember the man who laughed. It remembered the woman who walked away.